As the dowager's icy fingers clawed at my collar, shoving me toward the freezing, lightless attic, she hissed that a worthless stray like me would never touch the Blackwood fortune. The stench of her overpowering lavender perfume was suffocating. She slammed the heavy iron door, locking me away to be forgotten forever. She thought she had finally won. She never realized that the Queen's legendary missing signet ring was hanging right around my neck. Before I reveal exactly how I took everything from her, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this story from? It began earlier that same evening. The cold up in the servants' quarters was not merely a matter of temperature. It was a living, breathing entity that seeped into my very marrow. I had been sitting on the edge of my narrow, lumpy mattress, wrapping a thin, moth-eaten woolen blanket tighter around my shoulders. Every gust of wind that battered the slate roof of Blackwood Manor sounded like a weary sigh, a grim reflection of my own exhaustion. For 6 years, I had been the estate's invisible ghost, a poor cousin tolerated only because of some unspoken charitable obligation the old Earl insisted upon. To the rest of them, to the vicious Dowager Countess Eleanor and her sneering nephew Thomas, I was a stain on the immaculate tapestry of their lineage. Downstairs, the house was draped in a stifling, unnatural silence. The old Earl of Blackwood, the only man in this sprawling, gilded prison who had ever looked at me with a flicker of genuine warmth, was dying. I knew the signs. The relentless scurrying of the physician's boots on the polished mahogany floors had ceased hours ago. The scent of bitter herbs and harsh medicinal tinctures had wafted all the way up the servants' stairwell, masking the usual aromas of roasted pheasant and beeswax. I had to see him. I had to see the man who, in the dark of night, used to slip me extra candles and books from the grand library. The man who was, though no one else in the manor knew it, my grandfather. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I crept out of the attic. The floorboards of the servants' passage groaned beneath my worn leather boots. I moved like a shadow, a skill perfected over years of avoiding the dowager's wrath. I descended the narrow, winding stairs, the rough stone walls scraping against the coarse grey wool of my simple dress. The contrast between my hidden existence and the opulence of the main house was never sharper than when I finally pushed open the concealed door leading to the grand hallway of the second floor. The corridor was a gallery of wealth. Heavy crimson velvet draperies blocked out the moonlight, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax polish and dying lilies. At the far end stood the double oak doors of the master bedchamber. The intricate carvings of the Blackwood crest, a stag entangled in thorns, seemed to mock me. I took a step forward, my hands trembling. I didn't want his money. I didn't want the estate. I only wanted to hold his hand as he crossed from this world to the next. I owed him, and more importantly, I owed my mother, his secretly legitimate daughter, who had died in exile, clutching the very secret that now hung heavy against my breastbone. Just as my hand reached for the brass handle of the bedchamber door, a voice snapped through the corridor like a coachman's whip. "And just where do you think you are going, you wretched little creature?" I froze. Turning slowly, I faced Dowager Countess Eleanor. She emerged from the shadows like a predator, her stiff, black mourning silk rustling ominously. Her face, sharp and pale as carved ivory, was twisted into a mask of utter contempt. Her cold, calculating eyes raked over my simple gray dress, resting for a fleeting second on my collarbone before darting back to my face. The overpowering stench of her lavender perfume hit me, a sickeningly sweet odor that I would forever associate with cruelty. "To pay my respects, my lady," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, though my insides twisted with anxiety. "I heard the physician leave. I only wish to sit with him for a moment." Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless laugh that held absolutely no humor. She closed the distance between us, her towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over me. "Pay your respects," she sneered, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are a charity case, Clara. a mistake of breeding that my foolish husband allowed into this house out of some misguided sense of pity. You have scrubbed the floors, you have mended the linens, and you have consumed our bread. But do not mistake tolerance for kinship." She raised a hand, her knuckles white, and pointed a single trembling finger toward the servants' hall. "Mongrels do not belong at a nobleman's deathbed. You will not soil his final moments with your pathetic, sniveling presence." The injustice of it burned in my throat like swallowed embers. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to tell her that the blood running through my veins was purer than the muddy lineage of her favored nephew, Thomas. I wanted to pull the heavy gold chain from beneath my dress and show her the undeniable proof of who I really was. But I remained silent. I lowered my gaze, playing the part of the defeated, submissive orphan perfectly. I knew the rules of this house. Observation was my armor. Silence was my weapon. "As you wish, my lady," I murmured. It was then she grabbed me, her nails digging into my collar, dragging me away from the only family I had left, and forcing me back up into the dark, freezing attic where this night began. As the heavy iron door slammed shut, the faint, rattling breath of the dying Earl ceased entirely, echoing faintly through the floorboards. The only protector I had in this wretched house was dead. I thought the worst part of this night would be losing my grandfather. But as I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place, a terrifying realization washed over me. I wasn't just grieving. I was trapped. The tolling of the village church bell shattered the dawn. It was a heavy, metallic sound that vibrated through the frosted glass of my single attic window, echoing deep into the hollow cavity of my chest. Each strike was a brutal confirmation. He was truly gone. My grandfather, the Earl of Blackwood, had passed into the shadows, taking with him the only fragile shield that stood between me and the unbridled cruelty of the Dowager Countess. I did not weep aloud. Tears were a luxury the helpless could ill afford in this house, and crying would only leave my eyes swollen, a sign of weakness the vultures below would eagerly feast upon. Instead, I broke the thin layer of ice crusting the water in my cracked porcelain wash basin. The freezing water stung my cheeks, a sharp shock that grounded my racing mind. I pinned my dark hair back severely, smoothing down the rough, coarse fabric of my faded gray dress. Beneath the high, scratchy collar, the heavy gold of the Queen's signet ring rested against my collarbone, a secret weight that pulsed with the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. When I finally descended the winding servants' stairs, the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor had already radically shifted. The suffocating silence of a deathbed had been entirely replaced by the frantic, terrifying energy of a hostile takeover. Terrified scullery maids were scurrying through the halls, hastily draping thick black crepe fabric over the gilded mirrors and the towering oil portraits of the Blackwood ancestors. The scent of medicinal herbs had vanished, aggressively scrubbed away, and replaced by the harsh odor of strong lye soap and the pungent smoke of a cheap imported cigar. I followed that foul smoke to the threshold of the grand study. The heavy oak doors, usually kept firmly shut to protect the Earl's privacy, were thrown wide open. There, sitting behind my grandfather's magnificent mahogany desk, was Thomas. The Dowager's nephew was a man of 28, though he carried himself with the petulant arrogance of a spoiled child. He had soft, uncalloused hands that had never known a day of honest labor, and a weak chin he attempted to hide behind a poorly trimmed mustache. He was already wearing a tailored suit of the darkest broadcloth, though it fit him poorly across the shoulders. He looked exactly like what he was, an impostor playing dress-up in a dead man's chair. Dowager Countess Eleanor stood behind him, her hand resting affectionately on his shoulder. Her black morning gown was impossibly crisp, the stiff silk rustling like dry autumn leaves as she surveyed the room. She did not look like a widow deep in grief. She looked like a general who had just conquered a wealthy nation. "Ah, the shadow finally graces us with her presence," Thomas drawled, noticing my reflection in the polished silver surface of a brandy decanter. He did not turn around immediately, taking a slow, deliberate sip from a crystal glass. At 9 in the morning, his breath already carried the sour taint of liquor. "I came to offer my condolences, my lord," I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed modestly on the intricately patterned Persian rug. The title tasted like ash on my tongue, but survival demanded submission. "Condolences?" Eleanor scoffed, her voice slicing through the thick cigar smoke. She swept around the desk, stopping just a few feet from where I stood. "Save your breath, Clara. We have no need for your hollow sympathies, nor do we have the patience to maintain my late husband's absurd charitable follies. The era of indulging strays has officially ended." Thomas spun the heavy leather chair around, leaning back and propping his polished boots directly onto the gleaming surface of my grandfather's desk. It was a desecration that made my stomach churn, but I kept my face an unreadable mask. "My aunt speaks the truth," Thomas said, waving his cigar dismissively. "I have been reviewing the estate ledgers this morning. It is abhorrent how much coin has been wasted feeding and clothing a girl who contributes nothing but gloom to this household. I am the Earl of Blackwood now, and I will not have my inheritance drained by a useless parasite." "I work from dawn until midnight," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "I manage the inventories. I mend the linens. I oversee the cellars. I earn my keep." "You do nothing a common scullery maid cannot do for half the cost," Eleanor snapped, stepping closer. Her eyes were wide with a manic, victorious energy. "You are a blight on this family's immaculate reputation, a constant, irritating reminder of the mud that coats the boots of the lower classes. But Thomas is a merciful lord. He is willing to give you a choice." "A choice?" I repeated, the word hanging heavy in the dusty air. "Indeed," Thomas smiled, a greasy, unsettling expression. "You have until Friday to pack whatever rags you call your own. You will leave Blackwood Manor. If you go quietly, I will arrange for a carriage to take you to the St. Jude's workhouse in the city. If you refuse, or if you cause a scene—" He paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "My aunt has already spoken to the head physician at the asylum in the northern parish. They are always looking to admit young women who suffer from hysterical delusions." The workhouse meant a slow, agonizing death from starvation and disease. The asylum meant being locked in the dark, chained to a bed, entirely forgotten by the world. They were attempting to erase me from existence. "By Friday," the Dowager whispered, her face inches from mine, her lavender perfume once again suffocating my senses. "Or you will be dragged out of here in a straitjacket. Do we understand one another, Clara?" "I understand perfectly, my lady," I murmured, my hand subtly brushing against the heavy fabric of my bodice. They dismissed me with a wave of their hands, returning to their plundering of the estate's documents. I walked back into the long, shadowed corridor, my footsteps completely silent. They believed I was a defenseless mouse cornered by wolves. They thought they held all the power, the wealth, and the law in their manicured hands. But as I touched the hidden shape of the Queen's signet ring through my dress, a cold, terrifying smile finally crept onto my lips. They had given me until Friday to pack my bags. I wondered if that would be enough time for them to pack theirs. By Wednesday afternoon, the relentless rain had transformed the sprawling grounds of Blackwood Manor into a sea of grey mud, matching the dismal, oppressive atmosphere within its walls. I was on my knees in the grand library, my rough hands dark with soot, as I methodically polished the heavy brass fireplace tools. To the Dowager Countess and her nephew, I was merely another piece of furniture, as deaf and dumb as the marble busts of their ancestors lining the bookshelves. It was this arrogant blindness that allowed me to be present when the foundation of their grand theft began to crack. The heavy double doors creaked open, admitting Mr. Sterling, the family's longtime solicitor. He was a frail, stooped man who perpetually smelled of dried ink, old paper, and sharp peppermint. Beneath his arm, he clutched a thick leather portfolio that seemed too heavy for his thin frame. Thomas was lounging on a velvet chaise, impatiently tossing a silver coin in the air, while Eleanor stood by the rain-streaked window, her posture as rigid as an iron rod. "Well, Sterling," Thomas snapped, catching the coin and pocketing it. "Have you brought the documents for the bank?" "The tailors in London are demanding payment for my new wardrobe, and I intend to clear out the old man's private accounts by tomorrow morning." Mr. Sterling did not bow. He walked slowly to the center of the room, placing his leather portfolio on the polished mahogany table. His hands, spotted with age, trembled slightly as he undid the brass buckles. "I am afraid, my lord, that the transfer of the Blackwood wealth is not a simple matter of signing a ledger," the solicitor said, his voice a dry, papery rasp. "I have spent the last 2 days reviewing the original charters of the estate." Eleanor turned sharply from the window, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards. "What nonsense is this? Thomas is the sole recognized male heir. The title is his. The wealth follows the title. The land and the manor, yes," Mr. Sterling corrected gently, pulling out a massive rolled parchment bound by a cracking, centuries-old red wax seal. "But the vast majority of the Blackwood fortune, the royal mining grants, the sovereign bonds, the untouchable coffers at the Bank of England, were bestowed by the Crown. They are governed by the Royal Edict of 1702. I slowed my polishing, letting the rag sit idle on the brass tongs. The silence in the room became incredibly thick. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that suddenly felt like a countdown. "Get to the point, old man," Thomas growled, sitting up, his face flushing with an ugly, dark red hue. "The edict stipulates," Sterling continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "that these specific crown grants cannot be inherited by bloodline assumption alone. To release the funds, the true legitimate heir must stand before the royal magistrate and present the physical proof of the crown's favor. You must present the Queen's signet ring." The delicate porcelain teacup that had been resting on the side table shattered against the stone hearth, thrown by Thomas's trembling, furious hand. "The ring?" Eleanor gasped, all the color draining from her sharply powdered face. Her composure, usually absolute, shattered in an instant. "That ring has been missing for over 20 years. The old fool lost it, or gave it away to some harlot before his mind went. It is gone." "Then the funds are locked, my lady," Mr. Sterling stated firmly, packing his papers away. "The royal magistrate arrives on Friday for the official succession ceremony. If Lord Thomas cannot place the heavy gold signet, with its specific inner engraving, onto the magistrate's table, the Crown will freeze the accounts indefinitely. Thomas will be an earl in name, inheriting this grand house, but he will not have a single penny to heat it, maintain it, or pay his debts." Panic, raw and ugly, twisted Thomas's features. "We will have one made. Today, send a rider to the finest jeweler in London. Tell them to forge the damn thing." "Impossible," Mr. Sterling sighed. "The magistrate has the royal registry. The ring contains a hidden micro-engraved cipher known only to the Crown. A forgery would be immediately detected, and attempting to present one is an act of treason against the throne. Good day to you both." As the solicitor bowed and exited the library, the air in the room grew dangerously volatile. I kept my head down, my breath shallow. Beneath my coarse woolen bodice, the cold, heavy gold of the Queen's signet pressed firmly against my skin. It was the very ring my grandfather had secretly given to my mother, his only true, legitimate child born from a clandestine marriage long before he was forced to wed Eleanor's sister. "Tear the house apart," Eleanor hissed, her voice dropping to a demonic whisper as she grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his jacket. "It must be here. He must have hidden it in the floorboards, in the walls, somewhere in this wretched manor. Hire men from the village if you must." "Rip open the mattresses! Where do we even begin?" Thomas stammered, his arrogant bravado entirely evaporated. Eleanor's eyes, wild and desperate, scanned the room before slowly, terrifyingly, landing on my kneeling form by the fireplace. A cruel, calculated light ignited in her pale gaze. "We start with the vermin," she commanded softly, pointing a trembling, ringed finger at my back. "Send the thugs to the servants' quarters. Strip their beds, rip apart their bags, and burn their belongings. Leave no corner of the attic unsearched. My heart stopped dead in my chest as I realized the sanctuary of my shadows had just been violently destroyed. If I returned to my room now, I was walking directly into a trap. I did not wait for a formal dismissal. Before the Dowager could turn her venomous gaze fully upon me, I had already melted into the shadows of the library's far corner, slipping silently through the concealed servant's door, hidden behind a heavy tapestry of hunting hounds. The moment the solid oak clicked shut behind me, plunging me into the cramped, windowless gloom of the secret passageways, my lungs seized. I leaned against the rough, damp stone of the corridor, my chest heaving as I fought to quiet my ragged breathing. The smell of cold earth, ancient mortar, and undisturbed dust filled my nostrils, a stark contrast to the suffocating cigar smoke and lavender perfume of the room I had just fled. My hands, still black with soot from the fireplace, were trembling violently. Eleanor had ordered the attic searched. If I had been up there, or if I returned now, they would strip my meager belongings to the floorboards. Worse, they might demand to search me. With shaking fingers, I reached up to the high, scratchy collar of my faded gray dress. I unfastened the top 2 bone buttons and reached inside the coarse wool bodice. My soot-stained fingers brushed against the thick, braided silk cord I had worn every single day since I was 16 years old. I pulled it upward. There, resting in the center of my calloused palm, catching the faint sliver of light bleeding through the cracks in the masonry, was the absolute destruction of Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood. The Queen's signet ring was incredibly heavy, forged from pure, solid gold that had never lost its brilliant, warm luster, even after decades hidden in poverty. The face of the ring bore the deeply engraved crest of the Blackwood stag, its antlers proudly entangled in thorns, identical to the carvings on the master bedchamber doors. But it was the inside of the thick gold band that held the true power. I tilted it slightly, tracing my thumb over the microscopic, intricate cipher etched into the gold, the royal seal of the crown, the undeniable proof of legitimate succession. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were not born of fear. They were born of a fierce, agonizing memory. I closed my eyes and saw her face, my mother, Margaret. The beautiful, forgotten woman who had been the old Earl's only true, legitimate child. He had married her mother, a beautiful woman of lower nobility, in a secret, legally binding ceremony of love long before his ambitious family forced him to abandon them and take Eleanor's wealthy, well-connected sister as his public wife. To protect his new political standing, my mother was erased from the family history, banished to a life of quiet desperation in a crumbling cottage on the edge of the moors. But he had never forgotten his firstborn. On her 18th birthday, the Earl had ridden out in the dead of night and placed this very ring in my mother's hands, securing her right to the family's true wealth, even if she could never claim the public title. When the consumption finally took her 10 years ago, leaving me an orphan at 16, she had pressed this heavy gold band into my palm. Her skin had been like dry paper, her breath rattling in her throat. "Hide it, Clara," she had whispered, coughing violently into a blood-stained handkerchief. "Never sell it, no matter how hungry you get. It is your blood. It is your right. One day, when the time is perfect, you will make them see you." It was the old Earl who had quietly brought me into the manor as a charity case after her death, keeping me close, yet tragically separate, unable to publicly acknowledge his own granddaughter without exposing the scandal of his past and destroying the Blackwood name. But now, he was dead. The name was already being dragged through the mud by an arrogant impostor and a vicious widow. A sudden, violent sound shattered my reverie. From the ceiling directly above me, the heavy thud of boots echoed against the wooden floorboards. It was followed immediately by the sickening sound of splintering wood and the harsh, coarse laughter of the village thugs Eleanor had hired. I realized with a jolt that I was standing in the passageway directly beneath my attic room. I listened, paralyzed in the darkness, as they tore my small sanctuary apart. I heard the sharp rip of my thin straw mattress being gutted. I heard the crash of my cracked porcelain washbasin shattering against the stone floor. They were destroying the few wooden toys my mother had carved for me, crushing my humble life into dust on the dowager's orders. A hot, searing anger ignited in the pit of my stomach, burning away the last remnants of the frightened, submissive servant girl I had pretended to be. I clutched the heavy gold ring so tightly that the sharp edges of the stag's antlers bit painfully into my palm. Eleanor thought she was hunting a mouse. She did not realize she had backed a lioness into a corner. I would not just survive this week. I would stand before the royal magistrate on Friday and take back the home that was rightfully mine. I hastily tucked the heavy ring back beneath my dress, buttoning the collar high and tight against my throat. I needed to move. I needed to find a safe place to hide until the succession ceremony. But as I turned to make my way down the dark, narrow steps toward the cellar, I froze. The heavy, rhythmic sound of footsteps wasn't just coming from the attic above me anymore. Someone had entered the secret passageway on the ground floor. The slow, deliberate scrape of leather boots on stone was echoing up the spiraling stairwell, moving steadily closer to where I stood, trapped in the dark. The faint, flickering glow of a lantern began to paint the stone walls below me in an eerie, dancing orange light, and a voice, terribly familiar and laced with malice, called out softly into the gloom. "Clara, come out, little mouse. I know exactly where you are." The voice belonged to Thomas. The flickering, golden light of the oil lantern painted elongated, grotesque shadows against the curved stone walls of the secret stairwell. He was ascending slowly, his heavy leather riding boots scraping against the uneven steps. He was not alone. The heavy, labored breathing of Mr. Bates, the dowager's cruel head footman, echoed just behind him. "She has to be in the walls, my lord," Bates grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The maids swore they saw her slip behind the tapestry in the grand library just before we tossed the attic." "Then find her, you incompetent fool," Thomas hissed, the stench of his sour wine breath traveling up the drafty shaft to reach me. "Aunt Eleanor wants her found tonight, and she wants her stripped to the skin. If she has stolen anything of value from my grandfather's chambers to pawn, I will personally see her hanged for thievery." Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of my throat. If they caught me in this narrow corridor, there was no escape. If they searched me as Thomas had just ordered, they would find the heavy gold chain around my neck. The Queen's signet ring would be ripped from my possession, my lineage would remain permanently erased, and I would be thrown into the asylum to rot in darkness. I had seconds to react. My hands flew to the high collar of my gray dress. I grasped the braided silk cord that held my mother's ring and yanked it violently. The cord snapped with a faint, terrifying pop, burning the skin at the back of my neck. The massive gold ring fell heavily into my palm. I could not leave it around my neck, nor could I hold it in my hand. If I had to run or climb, it would slip from my sweat-slicked fingers. With frantic, trembling hands, I gathered the heavy, coarse woolen fabric of my dark gray skirts. I found a frayed seam near the hem of my thick underskirt, a tear I had meant to mend just yesterday. Using my fingernails, I violently ripped the stitches wider, the sound of tearing thread masked only by the approaching clatter of Thomas's boots. I shoved the heavy gold ring deep into the lining of the hem. It dropped to the very bottom, a cold, solid weight that knocked reassuringly against my ankle. "Check the alcoves," Thomas commanded, his lantern light now rounding the final curve of the spiraling stairs. "Thrust your walking stick into every shadow." I pressed my back flat against the freezing damp stone wall, sliding sideways until I reached a narrow, vertical recess behind a structural pillar, a forgotten priest hole I had discovered while cleaning the masonry 5 years ago. It was barely wide enough for a child, coated in decades of suffocating black dust. I squeezed my shoulders inward, ignoring the sharp scrape of jagged rock tearing through the fabric of my sleeves and slicing into my flesh. I pulled my skirts in tightly, holding my breath until my lungs burned with an agonizing fiery heat. Thomas stepped onto my landing. The heat radiating from his lantern washed over my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself so hard into the stone I felt I might merge with the architecture itself. Thwack! The heavy silver handle of Thomas's walking stick slammed against the wall mere inches from my nose. A shower of loose mortar rained down on my eyelashes. "Nothing here but cobwebs and rat droppings," Thomas growled in frustration, completely blind to my trembling form hidden within the deep shadow of the pillar. He pushed past my hiding spot, storming up toward the servants' attic, where his men were still tearing my meager life to shreds. Bates followed, his heavy footsteps vibrating through the floorboards. The moment their lantern light faded into the upper levels, I exhaled a shaky, silent breath. I did not waste a single second. I slipped out of the crevice and practically flew silently down the stone steps, heading in the opposite direction toward the deepest bowels of Blackwood Manor. The heavy gold ring clacked rhythmically against my ankle bone with every step, a secret bell tolling my survival. I navigated the pitch-black labyrinth of the cellars purely by memory, bypassing the wine vaults and the cold storage until I reached the furthest, most isolated room, the coal chute. The air here was utterly suffocating, thick with microscopic black dust that coated the back of my throat. I crawled over the mounds of jagged black coal, finding a small, recessed corner behind the main iron furnace. It was freezing. It was filthy. But it was safe. I pulled my knees to my chest, shivering uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to leave my bloodstream. I only had to survive in this dark tomb until Friday morning. 2 days. 2 days in the freezing blackness. And then I would walk into the light of the grand hall and destroy them. But as I settled into the coal dust, a faint, metallic scraping sound drifted down from the iron ventilation grate located in the ceiling directly above me. It was connected to the Dowager's private sitting room. I crawled forward, pressing my ear against the cold iron bars. The muffled, frantic voices of Eleanor and Thomas drifted down through the shaft. "The girl is gone, Aunt Eleanor," Thomas was saying, his voice laced with genuine panic. "She is not in the walls. She is not in the house. She has vanished into the storm." "Then she is dead in the mud, which solves one problem," Eleanor replied, her voice as sharp and cold as shattered glass. "But it does not solve the magistrate. If the old fool Sterling is right, we cannot claim the funds without the signet ring." "What do we do? We are ruined." "Silence your sniveling, Thomas," Eleanor hissed. I heard the sharp slap of a hand striking a face. "I have already sent a rider into the village to intercept the magistrate's carriage. We are not waiting until Friday." My heart stopped dead in my chest. "I have paid a fortune in bribes." The Dowager's voice echoed down the metal shaft, dripping with a terrifying, absolute malice. "The succession ceremony will take place tomorrow at high noon. We will present a forged document claiming the ring was destroyed in a fire. And if that wretched, invisible Clara somehow survived the storm and tries to show her face to contest it." A cold silence stretched between them before Eleanor delivered her final damning order. "Tell the gamekeeper to starve the hunting hounds tonight. If she steps foot on the grounds tomorrow, release the pack and let them tear her to pieces before she ever reaches the front door." The night I spent buried in the coal cellar was a masterclass in agony. Every breath I drew scraped against my throat, thick with the acrid metallic taste of black dust. The freezing stone sapped the warmth from my bones until my fingers were too stiff to curl into fists. Yet every time exhaustion threatened to pull me into a dangerous, perhaps permanent sleep, I shifted my leg. The heavy gold of the Queen's signet ring, safely sewn into the hem of my skirts, would knock solidly against my ankle bone. It was a cold, hard reminder of my purpose. I was not a rat hiding in the dark. I was the rightful lady of Blackwood Manor, waiting for the dawn. By late morning, the vibrations traveling through the foundation told me the gathering had begun. The heavy, rhythmic rumble of carriage wheels rolling over the cobblestone courtyard echoed down into my dark tomb. The muffled shouts of groomsmen and the frantic scurrying of servants on the floors above formed a chaotic symphony of false celebration. The succession ceremony was hours earlier than legally permitted, entirely orchestrated by Eleanor's bribes. I brushed the thickest layers of coal soot from my face, though my grey dress was irreparably stained black. I did not care. My appearance would only amplify the brutal truth of their cruelty. I crept out from behind the iron furnace, my joints popping in protest, and slipped back into the hidden labyrinth of the servant corridors. I climbed the narrow, pitch-black stairwells, avoiding the main landings where the hired thugs might still be patrolling. My destination was the musicians' gallery, a narrow, carved wooden balcony suspended high above the great hall. It had not been used in decades, veiled in heavy shadows and thick velvet draperies, making it the perfect vantage point. When I finally pushed aside a moth-eaten tapestry and stepped onto the creaking floorboards of the gallery, the sheer scale of the deception below stole my breath. The great hall was a blinding display of stolen opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, fracturing light over the county's elite. Lords in sharply tailored broadcloth and ladies in sweeping silk gowns of emerald and sapphire mingled, completely ignorant of the rot at the center of the room. The air wafted up to me, a sickeningly rich blend of roasted meats, expensive French perfumes, and the sweet, heavy scent of hothouse lilies arranged in massive silver urns. At the front of the hall, seated behind a long, velvet-draped table, was the royal magistrate. He was an imposing figure in his crimson robes of state, an enormous powdered wig sitting heavily upon his head. Flanking him were two massive guards of the crown, their silver breastplates gleaming, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. Mr. Sterling, the frail solicitor, sat at the edge of the table, looking incredibly pale and defeated, his leather portfolio clutched tightly to his chest. Then, the grand oak doors swung open, and the usurpers made their entrance. A hush fell over the crowd as Dowager Countess Eleanor swept into the room. She was practically vibrating with wicked triumph. Her mourning attire had been discarded for a gown of deep, bruised purple velvet, and a collar of diamonds, my grandmother's diamonds, sparkled viciously at her throat. She moved like a queen stepping up to a throne, her chin raised, her eyes scanning the crowd to ensure every noble head bowed in her presence. Thomas walked beside her, trying desperately to project an air of authority. He wore a ceremonial military coat he had not earned, heavily embroidered with gold thread, though he tugged nervously at the stiff collar. His face was pale, glistening with a thin sheen of nervous sweat. He knew the terrifying risk they were taking. Forging a document to the crown was a gamble that ended in absolute power or the executioner's block. I knelt on the dusty floorboards of the gallery, peering through the intricately carved wooden balustrades. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, rhythmic drumbeat of anticipation. The moment was rapidly approaching. I reached down, my soot-stained fingers tracing the rip in my hem, ready to extract the massive gold ring. The magistrate struck a heavy wooden gavel against the table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing the murmured conversations of the nobility. "We are gathered under the authority of the crown," the magistrate's voice boomed, deep and resonant, bouncing off the stone walls, "to witness the legal succession of the Earl of Blackwood, and to execute the transfer of the sovereign grants bestowed upon this house." Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on Thomas's back, urging him forward. He stepped up to the table, clearing his throat, his hands visibly shaking. "Before we proceed to the oaths," the magistrate continued, his severe gaze locking onto Thomas, "the Crown requires the physical presentation of the royal artifact. Lord Thomas, step forward and place the Queen's signet ring upon the table." I shifted my weight to stand, ready to throw the velvet drapes aside and scream my objection to the entire hall. But as my hand grasped the curtain, a sudden, terrifying sound froze the blood in my veins. The heavy wooden doors to the gallery slammed shut directly behind me, and the distinct, chilling click of a brass lock turning echoed in the small, dark space. I spun around, plunging my hands against the solid wood, but I was entirely trapped, caged in the dark, just as Thomas began to speak his fatal lie. The heavy brass lock clicked with a finality that felt like a guillotine dropping. I threw my weight against the solid oak doors of the musicians' gallery, my soot-stained hands slipping against the polished wood. They did not yield a fraction of an inch. Bates, the Dowager's monstrous footman, must have spotted my shadow slipping up the back stairwell. He had silently stalked me, waiting until I was entirely distracted by the spectacle below to seal me in this velvet-draped cage. I pressed my face against the intricately carved balustrade, peering down through the gaps in the wood. A terrifying helplessness washed over me. I was 50 feet above the great hall, rendered entirely invisible and mute by the heavy, sound-dampening velvet curtains that framed the gallery. If I screamed, my voice would be nothing but a muffled wail. They would not halt a royal succession for a wailing ghost. Eleanor would simply claim the asylum carriage had arrived to collect a hysterical maid. Below, the absolute silence of the nobility was deafening. Every eye, every glittering jewel, and every breath in the vast vaulted room was fixed upon the velvet-draped table. "The crown awaits, Lord Thomas," the magistrate repeated, his deep voice carrying a sharp edge of impatience. He extended a gloved hand, palm open, waiting for the heavy gold artifact. Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His face was a ghastly pale mask of terror. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. He looked utterly pathetic, a terrified boy suffocating in a stolen, gold-embroidered military coat. It was Eleanor who saved him. She did not stumble, she did not sweat. She moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a viper sliding through tall grass. She stepped gracefully in front of her nephew, effectively shielding his trembling form from the magistrate's piercing gaze. "My lord magistrate," Eleanor began, her voice ringing out through the hall. It was a masterclass in theatrical sorrow, dripping with a sickeningly sweet melancholy. "We beg the crown's forgiveness for this moment of profound emotion. My nephew is overcome by the weight of his uncle's passing." "Emotion does not satisfy the law, Dowager Countess," the magistrate replied coldly. "The edict of 1702 requires the Queen's signet ring." Eleanor bowed her head, pressing a lace handkerchief to her dry eyes. "Tragically, Your Grace, the physical ring can no longer be presented. It was destroyed." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of aristocrats. Mr. Sterling, the frail solicitor, shot up from his chair, his face flushed with sudden outrage. "Destroyed? My lady, that is impossible. A royal artifact of that magnitude." "Silence, Sterling," Eleanor snapped, dropping the grieving widow act for a split second before smoothly recovering. She turned back to the magistrate, her chin held high. "It was lost decades ago during the tragic fire that claimed the West Wing. My late husband, the Earl, was deeply ashamed. He kept the loss a secret from the public to protect the estate's standing." "A convenient tragedy," the magistrate noted, his eyes narrowing beneath his powdered wig. "But without the cipher engraved within that ring, the crown grants remain sealed. The bloodline must be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt." "And so it shall be," Eleanor declared, her voice rising to a triumphant crescendo. She gestured to Thomas. "Look upon him. The Blackwood blood is the only cipher this county needs. His lineage is pure, untainted by the filth of commoners or the scandal of illegitimate muddy affairs. To deny my nephew his rightful inheritance over a melted piece of jewelry is to deny the very foundation of our nobility." The crowd murmured in agreement. Eleanor had played them perfectly. She had appealed to their vanity, their obsession with pure bloodlines, and their collective hatred of the lower classes. She reached into the folds of her deep purple velvet gown and withdrew a thick roll of parchment. "Furthermore," she announced, placing the document onto the table with a heavy thud, "I present a sworn royal affidavit, signed by the late Earl himself and sealed with his personal wax crest, explicitly naming Thomas as the sole inheritor of all sovereign grants, overriding the need for the lost signet." Mr. Sterling leaned over, inspecting the red wax seal. I could see the exact moment the old solicitor realized it was a masterful forgery. His shoulders slumped, but he remained silent. Eleanor had likely threatened his life, or his livelihood, before the ceremony began. The magistrate pulled the document toward him. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes scanning the elegant, falsified calligraphy. The silence in the hall stretched so tight, I thought it might snap the vaulted ceiling beams. I could not wait any longer. I tore myself away from the balustrade and spun around in the suffocating darkness of the gallery. I desperately felt along the stone wall behind the tapestries. My fingers, numb and bleeding, snagged on a rusted iron latch hidden entirely by decades of dust. It was the maintenance hatch for the servants' chimney sweep, a vertical claustrophobic drop that led directly into the ash pit of the great hall's massive central fireplace. It was madness. The shaft was impossibly narrow, lined with jagged bricks and decades of accumulated soot. If I got stuck, I would suffocate in the walls. I looked down at the hall one last time. The magistrate gave a slow, solemn nod. He reached for the heavy silver inkwell, his fingers brushing the long white feather of his quill. He was going to sign it. He was going to hand my mother's legacy, my grandfather's home, to the monsters who had murdered my past. I dropped to my knees, violently ripping the hem of my dress to extract the heavy gold ring. I clutched it fiercely in my teeth to free my hands. With a silent prayer to the ancestors I was about to claim, I ripped open the iron hatch and plunged feet first into the absolute, suffocating darkness of the wall, just as the magistrate dipped his quill into the black ink. The descent was an agonizing plunge through centuries of black rot. The jagged, uneven bricks of the chimney shaft tore through the coarse wool of my sleeves, slicing raw tracks into my forearms and shoulders as I braced my weight against the narrow walls to control my fall. Every agonizing inch was a battle against gravity and suffocation. The air was practically unbreathable, thick with the acrid, choking dust of burned oak and ancient soot. I clamped my teeth down violently on the Queen's signet ring, the sharp, solid gold edges of the blackwood stag biting deep into my tongue, tasting strongly of copper and iron. It was the only thing anchoring me to consciousness as I slid deeper into the suffocating dark. I hit the bottom of the shaft with a heavy, muffled thud, landing squarely in the deep mound of soft, powdery ash that filled the belly of the great hall's massive central fireplace. My knees buckled, and I fell forward, my hands plunging into the cold, gray dust. I was bruised, bleeding, and trembling so violently my teeth chattered against the heavy gold ring in my mouth. But I was alive. Beyond the heavy iron grate of the hearth, the hall was locked in a terrifying, expectant silence. I spat the heavy ring into my soot-stained, bleeding palm, my fingers curling tightly around the warm gold. I crawled forward, the ash shifting beneath my skirts. Through the iron bars, I saw the magistrate's hand moving. The long white feather of his quill was hovering a mere inch above the forged parchment, dripping with dark, permanent ink. I did not hesitate. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy iron grate. With a shrieking grind of metal against stone, the grate swung outward, slamming violently against the marble hearth. A massive billowing cloud of black soot and gray ash erupted from the fireplace, rolling across the pristine, polished floorboards of the great hall like a sudden storm front. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Lords stumbled backward, spilling their crystal goblets of wine. Ladies in their vibrant, expensive silks shrieked, pressing delicate lace handkerchiefs to their faces to ward off the sudden cloud of filth. I stepped out of the rolling black smoke. I was a terrifying apparition. My gray servant's dress was shredded at the shoulders, soaked in blood and coated entirely in thick black soot. My dark hair had escaped its severe pins, falling around my face in wild, tangled ribbons of ash. I left heavy, dark footprints on the priceless Persian rug with every step I took toward the velvet-draped table. The scent of fear, sharp and metallic, instantly overpowered the suffocating aroma of expensive French perfume and hothouse lilies. "Good God! What is that creature?" A duke stammered from the front row, throwing his hands up in disgust. Thomas let out a high-pitched, strangled noise. He scrambled backward so quickly his polished boots slipped on the floor, sending him crashing into the heavy velvet draperies behind the table. He looked as if he had just seen a demon crawl from the depths of hell. But Eleanor did not retreat. The Dowager Countess's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. The veins in her pale neck bulged against her diamond collar. "Guards!" Eleanor screamed, her voice tearing through the hall, high and hysterical. "Seize her! It is the mad scullery maid. She has escaped the asylum. Shoot her where she stands before she soils the magistrate." The two massive guards of the crown instantly drew their swords, the long, polished steel singing a deadly note as they stepped forward to block my path. The heavy blades gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, pointed directly at my chest. I did not flinch. I did not cower, and I did not look at the ground. The quiet, submissive orphan who had scrubbed their floors was dead, left behind in the dark of the chimney shaft. I straightened my spine, ignoring the agonizing sting in my torn shoulders, and locked my gaze completely on the royal magistrate. "Halt!" I commanded. My voice was not a scream. It was not a plea. It was low, steady, and vibrating with an unshakable, terrifying authority that shocked the guards into freezing in their tracks. The entire hall fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Even Eleanor's mouth snapped shut, her eyes wide with bewildered terror. I walked directly to the table, stepping between the sharp points of the guards' swords. I looked down at the forged document, then up at the magistrate, whose quill was still suspended in the air. "You cannot sign that document, Your Grace," I stated clearly, the words ringing out against the stone walls. "Because Dowager Countess Eleanor Blackwood is a liar, a forger, and a usurper of the crown's law." "How dare you speak to—" Eleanor hissed, lunging forward. I silenced her without looking away from the magistrate. I slowly uncurled my bleeding, soot-stained fingers. The brilliant, undeniable luster of the solid gold artifact caught the light of the chandeliers, cutting through the grime on my skin. With a deliberate, forceful motion, I slammed the Queen's signet ring down onto the polished mahogany table, right on top of Eleanor's forged parchment. The heavy gold hit the wood with a loud, absolute crack. It spun for a fraction of a second before settling perfectly still, the intricately carved blackwood stag gleaming brightly, entirely mocking Thomas's fake military coat. The magistrate dropped his quill. He stared at the massive ring, his face turning an ashen, ghostly white. Mr. Sterling, the solicitor, let out a ragged, disbelieving sob and fell to his knees beside the table. The silence in the room was no longer expectant. It was explosive, a powder keg waiting for a single spark. The magistrate slowly reached out with a trembling, gloved hand. He picked up the heavy gold band, pulling a small jeweler's loop from his crimson robes. He held the ring up to the brilliant light of the chandelier, tilting it to inspect the inner curve of the metal where the secret, microscopic cipher resided. He stared through the lens for what felt like an eternity. His breathing completely stopped. Then he lowered his hand, his eyes locking onto mine with an expression that made the blood freeze in my veins. The magistrate lowered the small jeweler's loop from his eye, his hand trembling so severely that the brass rim clinked faintly against the heavy gold of the ring. He did not look at the dowager. He did not look at the false Earl trembling against the velvet curtains. His pale, watery eyes remained locked entirely on me, a soot-covered, bleeding servant girl who had just materialized from the ashes of the hearth. The silence in the great hall was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to draw all the air from my lungs. I could hear the erratic, shallow breathing of the aristocrats in the front row. I could smell the sour, metallic tang of Thomas's sweat, cutting through the cloying scent of the hothouse lilies. "The cipher," the magistrate finally whispered, his voice incredibly thin, entirely stripped of its former booming authority. "The royal microscopic cipher of Queen Victoria. It is perfect. It is authentic." A collective, shuddering gasp swept through the vast room. The rustle of expensive silk and broadcloth sounded like a sudden wind moving through a dense forest. "Impossible!" Eleanor shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat like a wounded animal. Her meticulously maintained facade of aristocratic grace shattered completely. She lunged toward the mahogany table, her manicured claws reaching for the gold band. "It is a forgery! A trick played by a filthy, thieving scullery maid. She stole it from a pawn shop. Arrest her. Touch that ring, Dowager Countess, and you will lose your hand," the magistrate roared, his composure snapping back with terrifying force. The two crown guards instantly stepped forward, crossing their heavy steel blades directly over the artifact, physically blocking Eleanor from the table. The magistrate turned his imposing figure toward me. The disgust he had initially shown at my soot-stained appearance had vanished, replaced by a profound, wary reverence. "The ring is undeniable," he stated, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "But possession does not equate to bloodline. The edict requires the true, legitimate heir. Who are you, girl? Speak your name to the crown." I stood taller, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain in my torn shoulders. I did not wipe the black soot from my face. I wanted them to see every ounce of the suffering they had inflicted upon me. "I am Clara," I said, my voice steady, ringing with an icy clarity that pierced the heavy silence of the hall. "Clara Margaret Blackwood, the only child of Margaret Blackwood, the true and legitimate firstborn daughter of the late Earl." "Lies!" Eleanor spat, her chest heaving, the heavy diamond collar around her neck glittering wildly. "Margaret was a bastard, a forgotten mistake. She had no claim, and this filthy rat has even less. She was his legal wife's child," a dry, papery voice interrupted. Every head in the room snapped toward the edge of the table. Mr. Sterling, the frail family solicitor, slowly rose to his feet. He was no longer the defeated, stooped man he had been moments ago. He stood straight, his eyes burning with a fierce, long-suppressed vindication. He reached into his thick leather portfolio and pulled out a small, faded black ledger, locked with a tiny brass clasp. "For 26 years, I have kept this hidden in the floorboards of my office, at the direct command of the late Earl," Sterling announced, his voice echoing clearly. He unclasped the ledger and laid it open beside the Queen's signet. The official, church-sanctioned marriage certificate of the Earl's first union, and the legitimate birth record of Margaret Blackwood. The late Earl knew his new, ambitious family would attempt to erase her. He waited his entire life for the signet to resurface, so the bloodline could be legally corrected. The magistrate leaned over the ledger. He compared the dates, the seals, and the signatures. Then, he picked up the forged document Eleanor had presented just moments prior and ripped it entirely in half, tossing the pieces onto the floor like garbage. "The claim is absolute," the magistrate declared, striking his heavy wooden gavel against the table. The sound was a death knell. "The Crown recognizes Lady Clara Margaret Blackwood as the sole, rightful heir to the estate, the title, and all sovereign grants." Thomas let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. His knees finally gave out, and he collapsed onto the polished floorboards, weeping openly into his hands like a terrified child. "No!" Eleanor screamed, throwing herself against the crossed swords of the guards. "This is my house! You cannot do this! I am the Dowager Countess!" "You are a fraud!" the magistrate spat, his face contorted in absolute disgust. "You have attempted to usurp a royal grant and presented forged documents to the Crown. That is an act of treason." He looked to the guards. "Strip them of their stolen finery. They are banished from these lands, effective immediately." The guards did not hesitate. One hauled Thomas to his feet by the collar of his fake military coat. With a violent tearing sound, the guard ripped the gold-embroidered jacket entirely off the usurper's back, leaving him shivering in his sweat-stained undershirt. The other guard grabbed Eleanor by the arms. As she kicked and shrieked, spewing vile curses that echoed off the crystal chandeliers, the guard reached to her throat. He unclasped the priceless diamond collar, my grandmother's collar, and let it fall heavily onto the table. The high society of the county, the very people Eleanor had spent her entire life trying to impress and control, reacted with brutal, immediate cruelty. As the guards dragged the screaming, disheveled dowager and the weeping Thomas down the center aisle of the great hall, not a single lord or lady offered a hand. Instead, they physically turned their backs, The rustling of their expensive silks was deafening as they formed a solid wall of absolute rejection, physically shunning the usurpers as if they carried the plague. I watched them being thrown out into the freezing, relentless rain, the heavy oak doors slamming shut with a final echoing boom that sealed their doom forever. The manor was finally mine. The war was over. But as Mr. Sterling gently handed me the keys to the master estate, he leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale peppermint, and whispered a truth about my grandfather's final night that made my blood run instantly cold. The heavy oak doors of the great hall had barely settled into their massive iron frames when Mr. Sterling pressed the heavy ring of estate keys into my soot-stained palm. The cool, jagged brass bit into my skin, a grounding weight amidst the dizzying aftermath of my victory. The murmuring aristocrats were already filing out of the room, their eyes cast downward, suddenly terrified of the ash-covered girl they had ignored for 6 years. Sterling leaned in close, his faded eyes shining with unshed tears, the scent of stale peppermint mixing with the lingering odor of the fireplace soot. "Your grandfather did not pass peacefully in his sleep, Lady Clara," the old solicitor whispered, his voice trembling with a dark, suppressed fury. Dowager Eleanor dismissed the physician hours before his final breath. She poured his heart tincture into the dying lilies beside his bed. She knew he was trying to hold on until my arrival the next morning to change his public will. A fresh wave of ice cascaded down my spine, freezing the very blood in my veins. "But he knew," Sterling continued, his gnarled hand closing firmly over mine. "When I slipped into his chambers through the servants' passage just moments before he passed, he could not speak. But he pointed a trembling finger toward the floorboards, toward the very walls of this house, and he smiled. He knew you had the signet. He knew his lioness was waiting in the dark. The revelation settled over me not as a burden of grief, but as a mantle of absolute clarity. My grandfather had not died a victim. He had died a strategist, placing his ultimate faith in the silent, observant girl who knew the shadows of Blackwood Manor better than the usurpers who claimed it. I did not sleep that night. The freezing, drafty attic with its torn straw mattress belonged to another lifetime. Instead, I stood in the center of the master bedchamber. The magnificent mahogany doors with their carved stags, the same doors Eleanor had slammed in my face just 3 days ago, were securely locked from the inside. A copper tub, dragged up by a team of bewildered but incredibly eager maids, sat before a roaring fire. I stepped into the scalding water, closing my eyes as the intense heat melted away the freezing terror of the coal cellar and the suffocating ash of the chimney shaft. I scrubbed my skin with lavender soap, not the sickeningly sweet, overpowering scent the dowager wore, but the fresh, clean aroma of the estate's own gardens. I watched as the water turned pitch black, washing away the soot, the dried blood from my torn shoulders, and the invisible, heavy stain of servitude I had worn for 6 years. When I emerged, I did not put on the coarse, faded grey wool of a scullery maid. Laid out upon the massive 4-poster bed was a proper morning gown, hastily altered by the village seamstress overnight. It was spun from the finest, heaviest black silk, its skirts full and unapologetic, whispering with a crisp, authoritative authority with every step I took. I pinned my dark hair back securely, no longer hiding my face, and at the high collar of my gown, resting perfectly at the hollow of my throat, I fastened the Queen's signet ring to a heavy gold chain, wearing it not as a hidden secret, but as a brilliant, undeniable badge of my bloodline. The morning air was crisp and biting as I walked the sprawling grounds of Blackwood Manor. The relentless rain had finally ceased, leaving the estate washed clean, the manicured lawns glittering with cold dew. As I passed the stables and the gardens, the groundskeepers and maids stopped their work. They did not sneer, nor did they look straight through me. They removed their caps and bowed deeply, offering a profound, silent respect to the new lady of the house. I walked past the grand iron gates of the family graveyard. The ancient weeping willows cast long, protective shadows over the weathered marble headstones. I carried 2 single perfect red roses, clipped from the bushes my mother had planted as a child. I stopped first at the grand, freshly carved monument of the late Earl, my grandfather. I placed the first rose upon the cold white marble, a silent vow that the Blackwood name would never again be tainted by the cruelty of impostors. Then I walked to the very edge of the graveyard, to a small, unassuming stone that had been hidden by overgrown ivy for a decade. I knelt, the heavy black silk of my gown pooling elegantly around me on the damp earth. I reached out and carefully pulled the vines away, revealing the simple engraving, Margaret. I laid the second red rose upon her grave. I pressed my gloved hand against the cold stone, a lump rising in my throat that tasted like sorrow but also like profound, absolute vindication. The tears I had denied myself for days finally fell, warm and healing, dropping onto the soil. I had kept her secret. I had endured the freezing dark, the starvation, and the humiliation. I had taken their arrogant cruelty and forged it into a weapon that destroyed them completely. The silence of Blackwood Manor was no longer a suffocating prison. It was a sanctuary. I stood up, the chill wind catching the hem of my silk gown, and looked back at the towering stone walls of my ancestral home. The shadows no longer held fear. They held my history. History shows us that arrogance precedes the fall. Support our production via super thanks if this story moved you. And remember, true strength is often found in the quietest corners of the room.